Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this last session on the UK International Coronavirus Network's seminar series. This session is about interdisciplinarity for pandemic preparedness. My name is Lisa Boden. I'm a professor of population medicine and veterinary public health based at the University of Edinburgh and the head of the veterinary school. And I'll be chairing this session this morning. Which will last about an hour. We have three very good speakers who are going to speak on the topic, and I will introduce you to them in a moment. Then we'll hear from them, three short presentations followed by some discussion around their topic. So I'm hoping for great contributions from the audience online. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Katie Adam, Sybylle Mohr, and Lukas Engelmann. Katie Adams is a lecturer of innovation at the life sciences at the University of Edinburgh, and she's a knowledge broker for EPIC, which is a Scottish Government centre of expertise for animal disease outbreaks. She's trained as a veterinary surgeon. She's worked in clinical practice, in epidemiology, and in social research as well as public health. And her research interests lie in the development and implementation of practical, innovative strategies to prevent and control infectious disease in animal and human populations. Our second speaker is going to be Sybylle Mohr. Sybylle is a research fellow in EPIC, again, the Scottish Government Centre of Expertise. She's based at the University of Glasgow at the School of Biodiversity, One Health and Veterinary Medicine. She has a background in computer science and cognitive psychology with a focus on network dynamics, and she's been working in veterinary epidemiology for a number of years. Her research is focused really on the modelling of dynamics, impacts and control of the UK's major livestock and zoonotic disease risks such as foot and mouth and avian influenza, as well as established endemic diseases such as sheep scab. And her other research interests include developing tools for early warning systems and investigating new technologies for the detection and control of emerging disease threats. Our final speaker of the morning is Lukas Engelmann, who is a historian of medicine and epidemiology and a senior lecturer in science, technology, and innovation studies. His research covers histories of epidemics such as HIV and AIDS and the Third Plague epidemic 1890 to 1950, the history of epidemiological reasoning, as well as the digital transformation of public health in the present. And since January 2021 until 2025, his work on the history of epidemiological reasoning is going to be, or has been, funded by an ERC starting grant. I'm sure Lukas will tell us a bit more about how we can find out more information about that organization. So with that, I'm going to hand over, first of all, to Katie, who'll share her screen. We'll pause on questions until the very end, but I'd be very happy for you to put any comments and queries in the chat box, and for anybody who wants to start networking in the chat box to sort of announce yourself and say who you are. And then we'll host all of the questions at the end. And with me as well, I can see that Hayley MacGregor has joined and is helping me co-host this session. So we will coordinate together on those questions at the last. Okay, with that, it's over to you, Katie. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lisa. Just share my screen there. Has that come up okay? Can everyone see? Just give me a shout if there you are, you're back. I can see you now as well. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this morning. So I guess the focus is on interdisciplinarity. I'm going to kind of talk about a triple dose of interdisciplinarity. So working across research disciplines, between scientists and policymakers at the science policy interface, and across animal and human health, looking at zoonotic disease risk. So I'd like to talk a little bit about, Lisa already mentioned, I am part of EPIC Scotland. So we're the Scottish Government Centre of Expertise on Animal Disease Outbreaks. So we are a multidisciplinary consortium of researchers based institutions throughout Scotland. And we're just one of several Scottish Government centres of expertise. So there are others on things like water, climate change, plant health, and other topics. And broadly speaking, our research programme has kind of two modes. So we have our preparedness mode in peacetime. Essentially, there isn't a current disease outbreak. And then if something does kick off, we're in a position that we can pivot very rapidly to respond to that. So a little bit of an overview here of how EPIC is structured with a particular focus on our work at the science policy interface. So the big blue box on the left here is intended to be our entire centre. Essentially, we're divided into separated, arranged into 6 challenges. Lisa and I both work mainly in challenge 1. So our official title is Provision of Rapid Access to Emergency Advice. And essentially, we're the sort of translators, I suppose, within EPIC. So the kind of a lot of the scientific work goes on in challenges 2 to 6, including sort of data management and data acquisition as required to support that work. And we also are linked closely with, I called it other science, which is perhaps not a great name, but we work more broadly with other researchers in this area in animal health and public health and other topics. And we also draw on available scientific literature in the work that we do and the advice that we provide to government. So the knowledge brokering work that I'll go on to talk a little bit more about is this part up here, essentially our connection with Scottish Government. So mainly translating our scientific outputs and also coordinating requests to respond to particular policy priorities from Scottish Government. And then there's our knowledge exchange work as well, which is essentially our external connections with other stakeholders, so the agricultural sector, the general public and other groups. If you're interested in finding out more about the EPIC model as a whole, I would direct you to Lisa and colleagues' paper down in the bottom right-hand corner here. So knowledge brokering in a kind of peacetime mode, so when there's nothing happening on the disease outbreak front, which feels like it's been a while now, most of this is about essentially building relationships. It's creating those connections with government and with other external groups. And as I say, it's about this kind of interpreting and coordinating. So making sure that scientific outputs from EPIC are understandable and useful to policymakers, and also coordinating requests that come in from Scottish Government to address particular policy topics. So directing those to whoever within EPIC is best placed to respond to those. And a lot of our work as well in peacetime mode is about contingency planning. So we maintain risk assessment libraries that can be drawn on in the event of a disease outbreak. So for example, things like foot-and-mouth disease. We participate in disease exercises. So there are regular national disease exercises, essentially a kind of dry run of what would happen in the event of an outbreak and who would do what. And we also have a communications protocol. So we're very clear on who needs to speak to who if something happens. I'm actually going to draw on a slightly different example. I know this is a coronavirus seminar, but I think looking at highly pathogenic avian influenza or bird flu is probably quite relevant here. So it's also a potentially zoonotic viral disease. And given that I'm not really talking about the biology, but more about the structures, I thought pulling in this quite current example might be interesting. So we are hesitant to use the word unprecedented. I feel it's had quite a lot of use over the last few years, but that kind of is the case currently with highly pathogenic avian influenza. We're seeing a global outbreak. Areas of the world that haven't been affected previously are now seeing this. There are various different strains globally. The current outbreak that we're seeing in Scotland, fortunately, is a strain, H5N1, that doesn't really affect people. It doesn't infect people very effectively at present, but it is affecting both domestic and wild birds and also wild mammals to some extent. And I thought just worth mentioning the human case of H1N1, which is usually associated with pigs. So fortunately, that individual has apparently a fairly mild disease, but it just highlights, I think, how easily influenza viruses can jump that species gap. So a little bit of an overview of the science, the research that's been going on in EPIC on HPAI. As I say, it's very interdisciplinary. We have scientists working across the natural and social scientists using a variety of qualitative and quantitative approaches. So just a couple of cherry-picked examples. Sybylle has been doing some mapping work on where the cases are occurring and when, and has created an interactive dashboard that policymakers or decision makers can use to see where and when cases are cropping up. There's a lot of mathematical modelling to understand disease transmission better. We have scientists working on phylogenetic analysis of avian influenza virus, looking at how that's changing over time. We have economists who work on essentially the costs and the impact of both the disease and disease control measures. We have social scientists who do a lot of work on understanding what farmers do and why. And all of this kind of feeds into a lot of our work within Challenge 1 is about producing risk assessments, so addressing specific questions for Scottish Government and looking at the potential risks associated with that particular question. So in the event of this current outbreak, this has been going on in Scotland since 2021. There had been previous outbreaks, but it's been pretty continuous. We've been seeing cases over the summer in more recent years. As I say, it's been affecting both poultry and wild birds. We've seen a couple of cases in wild mammals, so it does seem that this particular strain can infect mammalian wildlife as well. And we've seen really large-scale wild bird mortality, in some cases for seabirds, particularly in Scotland over the last few years. So EPIC's role in this has been, as I've said, it's that sort of coordinating role, translating outputs, coordinating requests, and also working with other key contacts. So we've been part of a Scottish Avian Influenza Task Force, which is led by Nature Scot, so Scotland's nature agency, and this is focused mostly on the disease in wild birds. And then we've also produced reports and advice for the poultry sector. And one of our main outputs has been a veterinary risk assessment looking at the question of whether wild bird carcasses should be removed or left in situ. If anyone's interested, I can pass on a link to that. So just to sum up, I think what I'm trying to highlight here is really that this kind of the knowledge brokering aspect is a really important part of effective pandemic preparedness, disease outbreak response. And so much of it is about building relationships, knowing who to contact, building that trust before it's really needed in the heat of an emergency. And also just to highlight that I think sometimes animal health, when we talk about pandemic preparedness, it tends to be quite focused on human health, but emphasising that animal health is a really important part of this conversation. And just to raise the question of whether the model that we have within EPIC Scotland may have broader applicability elsewhere for pandemic preparedness and response. So thank you very much. Lisa, I think we're taking questions later on, so I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Katie. Some key points I think to bring up in the chat box around perhaps the role of knowledge brokers in translation in an interdisciplinary setting, as well as models for bringing together interdisciplinarity. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask Sybylle if you can share your screen.
Yes, I'm about to. So I'm in a hotel room in Italy. I'm hoping Wi-Fi will hold up. Okay, so can you see that?
Yep.
As Katie and Lisa have already pointed out, I'm also part of EPIC, but during the pandemic, I had been part of the Scottish COVID-19 Response Consortium, and today I will give you a short overview of the modeling work that we had done there. Oh, I can't proceed. Okay, good. So the SCRC was created in response of call by the Royal Society for Rapid Assistance in Modeling the Pandemic, the so-called RAMP initiative. And initially it was created between the Boden Centre for Population and Ecosystem Health at the University of Glasgow, the Scottish Government Centre of Expertise on Animal Disease Outbreaks, so EPIC, and Biomathematics and Statistics Scotland. And so between us, we had a wealth of expertise on reacting to animal disease outbreaks, as well as modeling and controlling animal disease threats. So modeling COVID-19 shares also many of these the same kind of approaches and challenges as modeling animal disease outbreaks. So what we did was we had taken already developed large-scale animal disease models and adapted them to the COVID-19 context to make kind of predictions of in the short term and long term development of the disease. And what happened then was that the Royal Society decided to support two projects a bit further. And this was, one of them was the SCRC, and another one was a group that did behavioral modeling. So because of that, we suddenly had access to 150 volunteers from various disciplines with various expertise. These included modelers, epidemiologists, data scientists, policy experts, software engineers, visualization experts, physicists, and so on. So it was a huge privilege for them to support us. Well, for us, for being supported through them. And what you can see here is an overview of the 6 models that we had taken forward. They had kind of different, they were at various spatial scales as well as at various epidemiological detail. And the model I'm involved in is the contact tracing model, which had been adapted from a foot and mouth disease transmission model and a spatial stochastic individual-based network model. That model is actually currently also used to look at different movement restriction policies in Scotland. So it's is also influencing policy. So in terms of epidemiology, we used a consensus that had been agreed on by the Irish Epidemiological Modelling Advisory Group, which is an adapted SEIR model with asymptomatic and pre-symptomatic infection. And all of the models use that particular disease progression. And the epidemiological part was led by Louise Matthews at the University of Glasgow. So the contact tracing model, as I said, it had been developed from a foot and mouth disease transmission model. It simulates COVID-19 spread through a network of age-structured individuals. And by contrast to the original model, we didn't have an explicit spatial scale anymore, but contacts could happen at various locations, so at home, at school, at work, at other locations. And the key questions we wanted to address was to look at optimization of contact tracing protocols. So we know that contact tracing is very effective in controlling disease transmission, and many countries had set up these digital contact tracing apps or were in the process of setting that up. And because the foot and mouth disease model, the original model had already contact tracing built in, so this seemed like a good way forward to look at this in the COVID-19 context as well. And we looked at, for instance, scenarios such as, is it better to have a 14-day blanket isolation versus having a more tailored isolation? So if the contact happened 4 days ago, is it enough to isolate for 10 days and so on? And then, of course, if you find an optimal contact tracing and testing scenario, you can also use that to inform flexible closing of schools and offices at a short notice. So I mentioned before, we also had visualization experts, and some of them were working on dashboards that tracked the ongoing disease outbreak, but also and also gave us statistical overviews. But every modeling team also had access to a visualization team that supported them with outputs of their model. And so typically my model is an individual-based model, and of course, quite often we don't really visualize at the individual scale to kind of convey certain messages. And they helped us to do that. So what you can see here is an example comparing two policies, a shorter isolation versus a longer isolation. And these are transmission trees or transmission chains. And if you can see more green, then all of these infections have been prevented by that particular policy. One of the other major outcomes of the SCRC was the development of an kind of open epidemiological data pipeline according to FAIR data principles, so fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. Everything is transparent from any kind of inputs, where the parameters came from, which kind of publications they are based on, when they have been updated, through the data processing process, the actual model runs, and then the output. So everything is open and traceable, which also can increase confidence and trust in models that influence policy. So just to sum up, the SCRC had been building on existing expertise, and we had built on existing models, which is, I think, also a good way to start out with in the pandemic context. So if you already know, a model is sound, and then you can build onwards from that. And of course, this is has been a huge effort by many people, and we were profiting from various expertise. And maybe one of the take-home messages is that the pandemic provided us with the opportunity to test these kind of novel interdisciplinary approaches of working in real time. And what we also realized very quickly was that developing and setting up the infrastructure takes time. So you should really do it in advance. Unfortunately, I would say we had limited policy impact. So I think only one of the models had actually influenced policy in Scotland, looking at hospital transmission. Yeah, so we would have liked to have, you know, a bit more impact, but yeah, so we need to kind of prepare for that in upcoming outbreaks and kind of get stakeholders maybe involved a little bit earlier. Also, I would say that memory and know-how fades very quickly. So these kind of lessons learned, you know, we should kind of urgent evaluate the data and information that we gathered during the modeling during the pandemic while it's still fresh, and to profit and be prepared for the next or upcoming epidemic or pandemic. And that's me. And these are all of the institutions and people involved. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Sybylle. Nice presentation and lots to think about there. And I see as well that there are there's at least one question in the chat box that we'll pick up towards the end. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Lukas for the final presentation before we go to discussion. Thanks, Lukas. And we can see your slides. It's great.
Just unmuting myself. Thanks, everyone. I wanted today use this forum to do a bit of a very brief, maybe provocation, maybe introduction into my ongoing work. So with the Epidemi Lab and the ERC Starting Grant, I've been looking with a nice team, taking a bit of a longer view on the history of epidemiology and the history of epidemiological reasoning, as we call it. The question basically is, how did epidemiology become the kind of authoritative science that is also has been throughout its history quite unusual science that never quite established its identity in a clarified way and has a lot of different niches and places. But my current question is looking a bit at the history of epidemiology through the filter of COVID-19 and asking the question, how has COVID-19 changed and also led the kind of call for a new kind, or is there indeed a dawn of a new kind of epidemiology that has been fortified or structured differently through COVID-19? And three things I think struck me as quite significant in that transformation and something that we are left with when we look at the future of epidemiology. The first thing I think is that what was really remarkable, and there's a lot has been written about, but there still needs to be a lot to be written about, the question of dashboards. That suddenly the dashboard became not only a technical tool of epidemiologists and policymakers, but it became a public vehicle to both convey epidemiological information, but also to create a form of epidemiological participation that goes far beyond what previous outbreaks or previous epidemic crises had brought about. Second, we see the rise of infectious disease modeling no longer just as an exercise of certain mathematical expertise that had for a long time a rather peripheral position in much of epidemiology, but I think to many, certainly in the public, but I think also to many in the field of epidemiology, infectious disease modeling has become a bit of a scientific backbone to what epidemiology is, and to some extent it has become identical with epidemiology. And third, I think what's really interesting is to see that the move towards pandemic and epidemic intelligence, and I use here that example of the WHO hub that has been opened in Berlin, is one that is almost entirely focused on data science and is incredibly, and to my point of view, frustratingly narrow in the conceiving and in the design of how to think about those challenges that pandemic and epidemics pose to us as global, national, and regional and local societies. So the question then is, what kind of interdisciplinarity are we talking about when we talk about interdisciplinarity for pandemic preparedness? And if you look at the website of the WHO Hub, it's plastered with phrases of interdisciplinarity everywhere. But if you dial down into the most recent call for experts that the WHO Hub has published, you find a very narrow list of very technically conceived and very strongly focused on data science, mathematical and statistical sciences expertise. And I think there is a risk here that we should pause on and think about a bit more careful, because I think if we take preparedness as a technological challenge, as one that we should address through the means of technology, as something that we can fix with technology, something that we can structure in terms of surveillance, in terms of security through technological means, we fail to recognize epidemics and pandemics to be much more than just technological problems. There's a vast array of problems and issues that epidemics bring about that these technological fixes will not address. And I, plainly speaking, wonder why that is not the number one lesson to be learned from COVID-19. We have the history, and of course the COVID inquiry is a fantastic source for working through this kind of the quite painful first few months of the UK policy on COVID-19, but we have a clear example here for how a quite convenient, not very well thought through concept of behavioral fatigue has been weaponized, I would almost say, to kind of like pilot a form of interdisciplinarity that had nothing to do with what the actual issues, the actual questions that quite quickly emerged throughout the pandemic were, that should have been addressed, questions of inequity, questions of discrimination and marginalization, and rather than to fantasize about an idea of behavioral fatigue on the entirely level of the population, the question should have been, how can we maintain and structure social cohesion throughout a crisis of like a pandemic that affects different parts of society very, very differently? So when integrating social sciences into epidemiology and into preparedness, I think we need to think about granular levels of expertise. We need to think about levels and forms of expertise that do not fit easily into the kind of technological instruments that we need to develop better surveillance capacities, but we still need to take those knowledge challenges on and develop the kind of expertise in providing knowledge brokerage, to go back to Katie, across these different lines and across these very different ways of thinking. But also we need to think about how we can bring the communities and the public in more ways than just by providing them with a dashboard where they can see what the epidemic currently looks like in forms of data points, because there's so many more dimensions where we need to kind of engage on that, and maybe we can unpack a bit of that in the discussion. The second point, and I think that's the point that I have to make as a historian, is that I think epidemiology and preparedness is increasingly becoming no longer not just interested in historical data and in historical information and in historical forms of reasoning and historical forms of thinking, but there is increasingly an anti-historical bias in preparedness, a kind of question that historical information or historical examples seem to deter, seem to like lead to mistakes. There's often the reference has been made in the COVID-19 modeling that the reference to influenza or to SARS has been more of an obstacle rather than an advantage in developing the challenges for COVID-19. But I think the point here is to think about history differently and to think about history more as like, how can we maintain a historical consciousness in epidemiology? Epidemiology has not just started within the last 10 years. There's a long and rich history, not just of methods and technological instruments, but there's a long history of how to navigate the challenges of epidemiological expertise in policy, around policy. The history of the WHO is full of examples across many different political contexts for that. And also it's a question of how to re-engage with the histories that have been brought about by epidemics, how epidemics have shifted not just kind of the economic indicators for societies, but how epidemics have shifted cultural, political systems and social realities for many, many parts of society throughout the 19th and 20th century, but also today. So to conclude, I think I want to leave you with this kind of statement that if the project of preparedness remains too narrowly focused on technical challenges, on something that can be resolved simply by looking at surveillance and looking at safety as forms of technological challenge, then we find that the project of preparedness is one that is mainly geared to protect and to maintain a status quo, but it does very little to challenge the actual conditions that turn epidemics and pandemics into devastating crises with lasting effects. And then we might have to ask, why do we invest in a preparedness that doesn't resolve those kind of causes? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lukas. That's a great place to start our conversation, I think. And thanks to all three of our colleagues for their presentations. Difficult to clap on camera. I always forget where the reaction is, but certainly I think these have been really well received. My duty now really is to try to open up the conversation. I think some of Lukas's points at the end around what it means kind of are sort of synergistic with some of the points that Sybylle ended with in terms of our failure, if you like, to sort of retain that historical memory. And there are questions I certainly have, Lukas, about what history entails when we're thinking about the deep and long history versus the short-term history, which collides with how, for example, models may be developed and sort of what we mean by the past to inform the present and the long-term future. I will ask Hayley to monitor the meeting chat. We have at least one question that I'm going to start with just because it is in the chat already from Professor Semple, who wanted to ask something specific. And so we'll start with something quite detailed as a question, and then maybe scope out into broader questions around interdisciplinarity, history, model making, and translation across disciplines, if you like. The question from Professor Semple is, do you have a pathway between EPIC and Public Health Scotland to hand on information about poultry workers and wildlife workers who may be exposed to pathogens of interest? And I think that question is leveled at Katie, but certainly I can come in and support Katie. But you're well positioned to answer this given your previous role, I think, in PHS.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I suppose in relation to the sort of the current avian influenza outbreak, the way I kind of conceptualize it is that sort of the Scottish Government and the incident response, which is mainly local authorities in the centre. And I guess Public Health Scotland and EPIC were answering quite different questions. So in EPIC, we were looking at the risk of onward transmission to other animals, so wildlife and domestic birds. Public Health Scotland were looking more at the kind of potential for transmission to people. So that's, I guess, the official pathway. I think the unofficial pathway is that there was a lot of connection between us and PHS in working on this. So we were both members of that Scottish Avian Influenza Task Force. And it's a small world in this sort of area of animal and human health in Scotland. We have personal connections with the people working on animal health within Public Health Scotland as well. So I hope that answers the question.
It sort of does. That's really kind of you. Where I'm thinking of is that the challenge we're getting is to demonstrate genuine interdisciplinary work. Mm-hmm. And where I'm seeing opportunities to establish this kind of relationship. For example, you might have deer workers, gamekeepers, river managers, or your poultry workers, or poultry rearers for the grouse, or for the pheasants, not the grouse. And if you know you've got an outbreak there, your relationship potentially with Public Health Scotland could allow you to do some quite nifty serology on potentially asymptomatic wildlife workers and get an understanding about if there's underlying asymptomatic exposure and or infection. And that might establish a pathway which in 5 years or 10 years might be incredibly valuable. So I'm just trying to work out, because I'd quite like to do something similar in England and potentially Wales. It just seems to me EPIC is one step ahead of us as usual. I'll stop there, but would love to hear your comments on what I've said. Over.
Thanks, Professor Semple. Katie, come back on that.
I think I was just going to say that sounds like a fantastic area to have a separate conversation. It might be something to take offline, but that sounds like a really interesting area to look into further. So yeah, thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
I think one of the challenges, and perhaps that's the segue from this, would be to move into a comment that Sybylle made about the challenges with translating in a timely way to create impact. So EPIC has these established pathways into which are very short in terms of our pathways to Scottish Government.
Diggy, come on.
Professor Semple, I think you're still live at the moment, and I hope you can find your dog. Yeah. So what I was going to say is that I guess what might be interesting for people is to think about, for example, why the Scottish COVID Response Consortium could not create impact with a pathway into policy, whereas EPIC, which is part of the Scottish COVID Consortium, could create a pathway to impact when it comes to Animal Health and Welfare Division. And that's a question to the whole panel, and I'd be interested too in terms of thinking about that with respect to not only translation, but it's also out to the audience to stimulate a bit of discussion about how you move that type of knowledge into the right audiences at the right time in order to create actual change. We can start, I could start with Sybylle, not to put you on the spot, and then maybe come to Lukas for some insights from a sort of a broader historical perspective, and back to Katie, and then the rest of the audience, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I should maybe also say, so we had early on also meetings with SPI-M, so the modeling group for the UK government, and initially it was kind of, discussed whether we would help them, but it kind of never materialized. Also, I think, we don't live in a vacuum, so there were these kind of political considerations as well, and so it was a bit difficult, but nevertheless, I think in terms of pandemic preparedness, so typically in a rapid response, you would rely on established relationships, I guess, so it would be better to kind of establish those in advance. And as you said, maybe we didn't have them, although we also had discussions with, so in the SCIC, also Public Health Scotland, everyone was involved. It was just, I think, they were just also overwhelmed, and just to deal with this situation, and it just didn't materialize. And sometimes they also relied on just what came from the UK government, I guess, from the response. So it would be really, good to kind of establish these relationships early, before anything happens.
And the interdisciplinarity of the different languages that we speak in terms of epidemiological language, the language of policy,
exactly.
And is what really matters, and why those knowledge brokering roles are so critical. I wonder if I can come to Lukas and Katie for any comments on that.
I mean, I can make just a brief comment on that. I think it's a really fascinating interface specifically between infectious disease modeling and policy. And I found the story of how modeling informed UK government policy extremely. I mean, we published a small paper on that, but also I was really quite amazed to what extent modeling was also perceived by policy often as a field that was particularly open to a high level of interaction in the production of evidence. So I think the polemical points have often been moved into, let's say, like, rather than science-based policy, it's a bit of a policy-based science. But I think one doesn't have to give in to those polemics, and rather think about to what extent does infectious disease modeling, with its focus on stochastic models and with its focus on a kind of prediction of uncertain futures, and with its language of uncertainty, also play very nicely into a language of evidence policy, scenario planning, and so on. So I often felt that there is when looking through the kind of ways how modelers and policymakers and journalists reflected on those first few months of the pandemic, there was often a surprise about the mutual level of understanding certain very prominent politicians bracketed out of this. But on the other levels between government and science, I think that's a really interesting point to take here.
Katie, any follow-up comments on that you want to make?
I'm maybe taking a slight tangent here, but I guess it's about sort of policy priorities, which I suppose are kind of societal priorities, and that we tend to take quite an anthropocentric view of infectious disease. Really, I feel there's very much an order of priorities, like if it affects people, obviously we care. If it affects livestock, we care a bit because we like to eat animals, you know, if that's helpful. And then kind of wildlife disease, I think, is even further down that pecking order. Until it affects us, it's not something that massively concerns us. And I think that can result in slightly siloed approaches sometimes to human and animal health. And bridging that gap is I guess, a bit of an ongoing challenge.
Thanks, and I guess that's quite a neat segue into the broader issues that Lukas brought up, and probably that others are thinking about in terms of what it means to take an interdisciplinary approach. We use that word quite loosely, I think, often using that word sometimes to refer to multidisciplinary streams that are happening in parallel rather than genuine interdisciplinarity or, God forbid, transdisciplinarity, which rarely happens. And there are lots of barriers to that, I think. And I wonder if I could open it up to include in the panel also comments from Hayley about this, but perhaps start with a big picture from Lukas in terms of what it means to actually bring those disciplines together in a more meaningful way in anticipation of another type of event. Drawing on what Katie's just said, perhaps thinking also about One Health approaches, which I know has been a topic that's been engaged with in this community. So start with Lukas, maybe Hayley to bring you into the discussion, and then the rest of the panel and anybody from the audience, if you don't mind. Good, please, go ahead.
I think the answers. Okay, I'm trying to do a big picture answer to this, and then we can dial it down maybe. But the biggest issue in the interdisciplinary collaboration on this, I think, is these are fundamentally differently organized languages and ways of thinking and ways of reasoning in different fields and different parts of the university, but different parts of of those sciences that are contributing to our understanding of epidemics. It's difficult enough to bring a historian working on the history of influenza to speak with a medical anthropologist who works on influenza outbreaks in, I don't know, a particular corner of the world. It's difficult enough to have them to agree on a form of language and a form of framing that allows them to have a meaningful conversation. And the world of mathematical reasoning is, for both of these groups, a world that is entirely alien but also deeply suspicious, because it has so many presumptions and assumptions, that so many first principles that are defined in ways that kind of quite substantially seem to contradict what historians do, what social sciences do. And so, aka empirical work and trying to understand what's out there rather than to think about laws of how to in which to describe in simplified ways what might be happening out there. And so in that way, there is, I think, a kind of fundamental difference of translation here, or fundamental difference of language that requires translation. But I think it's a translation that needs to be done on both ends. And that, for me, is always the stick and stone. It's like I would never provide myself with the position that we in the histories and social sciences know how to do this, and there's just the scientists working with models are unwilling to cooperate. On the contrary, there's a fantastic conversation and everything, but the obstacles are sometimes, I think, more strongly felt in the social science and humanities than on the other side. And I feel like I hope that my own work on the history of modeling will contribute that's certainly the aim of my own work, trying to kind of weaken some of those obstacles and provide a bit more understanding via the avenue of describing how and under what circumstances modeling has become the important thing that it is. And I think that's certainly one way to do this, but there are also other ways. But it requires those quite systematic and fundamental attempts on understanding and openness to really accept that there are very different fundamentals that govern what we do here and there.
Yeah, and I suppose I think that was quite a nice kind of entry point here. I guess just to interject in between, to think about these types of conversations take quite a lot of time. And one of the reasons I wonder and think about is, you know, in terms of operating in shortness of time, the expediency of the mathematical language and the mathematical modeling is often privileged, really, with respect to delivering that evidence base into policy, as opposed to sort of perhaps the more qualitative, rich, and sometimes messy data that the social sciences provide, which doesn't offer sort of concrete, or if you can be concrete in the face of uncertainty, decision-making points. So there's a conversation there which I wanted to bring in, Hayley, if not to put you on the spot, but to ask for your opinion, again, thinking about how we move from multidisciplinary strands, which is very valuable still, but into more interdisciplinary, perhaps holistic systems approaches.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for very interesting talks. And Lukas, I guess as a social scientist, I particularly appreciated your intervention, because I think, as you put it very well, you know, primarily one of the biggest challenges are these different epistemological positions that we don't even necessarily fully appreciate, that we all come from different positions, and that those also involve different sort of research temporalities. And I think you illustrated that beautifully, you know, that sort of more longer term view, the kind of history of thought in epidemiology versus this very rapid sort of real-time data focus. And there's such a gulf between. And of course, as we well know from our own experience, that as social scientists and people in the humanities, that there are these hierarchies of knowledge that then get created and that can really undermine equitable intellectual partnership and really bringing different ways of thinking about these problems to bear on these issues of pandemic preparedness. And I, from my own experience, really do believe there's an extraordinary richness that can be gained from trying to make that effort, but it does require effort. And I think, Lisa, you put it very well. It's not only effort in relationship building, but also in learning to speak across these language and knowledge divide, so that work of translation. But really, I mean, it's quite topical, isn't it, given these new calls where, for example, we have UK-RI appreciating interdisciplinarity, building interdisciplinarity in the UK for work on pandemic preparedness. But I do have reservations that for some people reading that call, it is simply an invitation to siloed working. So how do we really get beyond that? And I think what I find quite interesting about your talk, Lukas, is this sort of thinking more critically about modeling, because I think quite often people do think that this synthesis or triangulation of different forms of evidence in interdisciplinary projects just happens through the kind of black box of the model. And I think less often do people put time into these, thinking about these overarching conceptual frameworks that might enable us to make the whole more than the sum of the parts. And I think your approach of really stepping back to think about different conceptualizations of preparedness at the outset is really the right one. And it really resonated with me, because we've just finished a Wellcome funded project at IDS on meanings and practices of preparedness. And I think you're so right, that sort of readiness framing, the technological framing of preparedness is really quite distinct from the kind of view you put across, that also has this much deeper historical perspective. So let's hope that some new consortia will emerge that will really take up this challenge. That would be my view.
Thanks, Hayley. That's a nice comment, and quite difficult actually, because I suppose some of these relationships and the facility with which you sort of create them and recreate them perpetuates that same framing over and over again, really, in the way that calls are named and how, in particular, that call, for example. Are there any comments that Katie or Sybylle, do you want to join in on that conversation about interdisciplinarity and kind of moving away from these sort of linear kind of multi-stream approaches into more integrated thinking?
Yes, maybe just looking back at the SCRC, you know, what you said about a shared language and a shared knowledge. So, you know, we also had to establish a common ground between all of us. So, well, so during the pandemic, we all just did this kind of modeling. So we had time to actually invest also time into getting everyone up to speed and seeing the different perspectives and the different experts who are giving seminars, you know, to kind of share their knowledge. And yeah, so it's really important to kind of establish this kind of common ground to be able to communicate and actually to work together. And that takes time. And, you know, so everyone has now kind of scattered. I mean, we still have collaborations going on, and you have now these established relationships, but we were really privileged. And if you need to prepare for a pandemic, I think you need to invest, and also that also means investing maybe money, right? To get these interdisciplinary relationships going somehow. Yeah.
Thanks, Sybylle. Katie.
I guess that the way I think about it, almost certainly within EPIC, and I think more broadly than that, is that there's kind of two roles. There's the sort of specialists who go deep into a particular topic, and then there's the kind of, I don't know, generalists, whatever you want to call them, those of us that kind of cross disciplinary boundaries and I guess can act as sort of interpreters, because so much of it is an issue of language, and someone who can translate, I think, is really important in building those connections.
Thanks, Katie. Yes, I mean, I think that sort of knowledge brokering role has proved pretty effective in EPIC in terms of kind of renewing and re-establishing those relationships, creating that pathway to impact into policy and other types of audiences. With that, I think we're coming up to the top of the hour here, so I just want to offer the panel an opportunity for any last thoughts on interdisciplinarity and any comments you might make. Lukas, I'll start with you and I'll work backwards just to give people time. Last sort of very brief thoughts that you want to leave us with.
I think I want to pick up one of the points that Hayley made that I think is really important, and that is that interdisciplinarity takes time, and it's not just taking time in terms of organizing, bringing people together, and taking the time to invest in those new relationships, but also to really understand the different temporalities with which different scientific projects work, and to appreciate that is a rhythm and a form of pacing that is not always comparable and might require a lot of interesting adjustments, but these can be really, really productive.
Thanks, Lukas. Sybylle.
Maybe a bit of a different thought, but I feel like, you know, there should be more equal access to this expertise, right? Many countries maybe, you know, didn't have immediately these kind of interdisciplinary consortia available. So I would like to have that, I guess, for pandemic preparedness, and also a bit more diversity.
Yeah, that's a nice point, Sybylle, just in terms of we didn't get there in terms of the diversity of the teams and the modelling teams and groups that are working in this area of preparedness matters. Katie, last thoughts?
Oh gosh, I don't know how I can follow that. I think that just echoing that point, I think that's a really important take on it, both in the teams working on this, sort of the researchers, the diversity there, but also I think we're back to Lukas's presentation, sort of connecting with the end users, understanding what people need from this, what people want, what's important, and how to sort of ensure equity when we're having these conversations.
That's great, thank you. Hayley, do you want to have any final words before I close?
I mean, I guess just to say that we've talked about research consortia, and of course there are these efforts to strengthen interdisciplinarity, but I think the next step is also to strengthen interdisciplinarity in scientific advisory groups in government. So just to sort of leave with that thought, because I think Lukas put it very well, that, you know, pandemic preparedness is also about changing societal conditions that have really accentuated the impact of epidemics, and to do so we also need social and political scientists, historians, ethicists on those advisory groups. So thank you to our panel for raising these fascinating issues.
Thank you, Hayley. That's a nice point on which to close. I want to just reiterate my thanks to all the members of the panel, Katie Adams, Sybylle Mohr, and Lukas Engelmann, and to Hayley for the support on this session. The next session, I think we're having a Christmas break. Next session starts again in January. We look forward, and thank you very much all for your participation and your patience. Thanks very much, everybody. Hope you have a nice holiday and New Year. Look forward to seeing you.
Thank you, Lisa, for beautiful chairing.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Lisa.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.